Welcome to Commander Central, episode 126, and today we'll be talking about listener Michael Phipps' Estrid the Masked Enchantress deck. I'm Dana.
And I'm Max.
Max, how you doing today?
Pretty good. You know, been pretty busy at the office with this Vegas rotisserie draft all day.
So, yeah, for those that don't know or don't follow us on Twitter, a handful of content creators are doing a draft for a children's hospital for charity. And basically, we're each drafting commander decks. So once one card goes from the available pool of, 20,000 cards for commander, that card's just gone.
Correct.
So it's been kind of interesting trying to figure out what's going to disappear and what hasn't. We started off each taking 3 commanders before we actually started with the draft. And who were the 3 you took, Max?
My first pick was Tristani Selesnia's Voice. So I thought it made everybody think I'm going, green-white.
Yep.
I followed that up with Anafenza the Foremost, so now I'm in Abzan. And my final commander pick was Krav the Unredeemed. So definitely going to go tokens and try to just outlast everybody with being able to refill my board state faster than anybody else.
Nice.
What about you?
I wound up opening with Marchesa the Black Rose, and I had a plan going in. I knew what I wanted to take. And I guess I could have tried to swap things around and take my second pick, who was Joyra, Weatherlight Captain, first, just to throw people off, think I was going in those colors, but I didn't. I wanted Marchesa, so I grabbed her. Took Joyra in the second round, and then I took Saheeli the Gifted in the third. And by the time this airs, we'll be pretty deep in the draft, so I'm not too worried about giving anything away. I'm very much going Grixis Artifacts, particularly any of the stuff with modular. So the plan is to cast things that have modular. There's, 20-some artifact creatures, or things like Triskelion. There's an artifact creature that comes into play with a counter on it. So they're immediately affected by Marchesa's ability, and then sacrifice them to various sack outlets I have, which will put counters on the other creatures with modular, and do that every turn. Keep sacking stuff, because I can do it on other people's turns as well. Bring them back and just build up a couple of giant modular beaters.
Sounds like a game plan.
So that's what my plan was as well, and I've gotten most of the pieces I wanted. But your deck, we were just discussing this off air, you have, really gotten... No one's competing with you for the most part for any of these token cards.
Not really. I got hosed on a couple that were it'd be cool if they're around in
right.
the 20th round, but oh well.
Yeah, Anointed Procession and Parallel Lives were your first 2 picks. And I should note there's a $200 budget for this. So you didn't want to go doubling season and lose a quarter of your budget with one card.
Right.
But you opened Procession, Parallel Lives, and then Divine Visitation. So 3 just huge, useful cards in a token deck right away. And then, of course, later on, grabbed Aura Shards and Hero of Bladehold and Hangerback Walker and Eldrazi Monument. And you've started putting a few win conditions in now, like Overwhelming Stampede and Aetherflux Reservoir. So you already have a bunch of really, really good pieces.
Well, thank you. And yours is just full of hate cards. Dictate and Grave Pact and Leyline of the Void and Ashiok and Narset. You're just a mean man, Dana Roach.
I certainly appear to be. I think that's probably most of the hate kind of stuff I'm going to take. And a couple of the cards were ones I just took to keep them away from people, because the way my deck's going to work, I need to use my own graveyard. So I'm like, well, I don't want Leyline of the Void out there screwing me over, so I might as well take it. It's useful anyway. Same with Ashiok. I don't want Ashiok out there hitting my graveyard when I'm trying to do graveyard stuff, so I might as well take Ashiok.
This was the worst part about the Leyline of the Void pick. It was my next pick. I'm ready, really? Cool, I have a backup to Anafenza. I'll be able to use my graveyard. I'm going to grab Leyline of the Void because nobody else has, and then poof.
I got it.
You got it. I actually had to leave my desk a little bit to cool down. I was so mad.
I was actually hoping when I grabbed Narset, some people would take some wheels, thinking I was going to take a bunch of wheels, but nobody has. They didn't bite on any of that so far.
We don't have a lot of blue players in this draft.
That's true, yeah.
Well, okay, about half of them, but whatever.
But they're leaning much more heavily into the Golgari part of those Sultai decks.
Yep, or just 5-color good stuff.
5-color, yeah. So I probably could have maybe waited on that. But I thought some wheels might disappear just to keep them away from my Narset, but not yet. So I have no intention of playing Narset into Windfall or Winds of Change or something. right now. But if, round 30 rolls around and Winds of Change is still sitting there or Windfall still sitting there, that's a whole different deal. If they let me go 10 rounds with Narset and all the wheels are still available, I don't know if I can resist that temptation.
That's fair. I guess I wouldn't try to resist it either.
So, also, this show's airing on Thursday, but on Monday, and I should have mentioned this last week, but I didn't know when it was going to come out. Well, the They Said We Said episode I did of John Dunning, They Said We Said is a YouTube channel that John Dunning does content for, and he does like 6 or 7. I mean, like, I'm barely exaggerating when I say 6 or 7 different podcasts or shows on his YouTube channel. One of which is called The Cult of Film, where he gets people on that he knows online to talk about movies. And myself and Zach Taylor from Commander Social were on Monday talking about the movie 500 Days of Summer. So if you are interested in listening to me talk about a movie versus talking about Commander, check out John Dunning's channel on YouTube. They Said We Said. Just do a search for it. You can find it. And the show that aired on Monday for Cult of Film had me on it discussing a movie I'm a big fan of.
Awesome. I started it after work tonight and got sidetracked, so I'll be finishing that up at the office tomorrow morning.
Well, and usually his ones, they're like 20 minutes to a half hour long. And Zach and I just talked forever, so like it went almost a full hour of us talking about one movie. So
nice.
It was a lot of fun, though, and John's content is worth checking out just in general, even if I'm not on it. He does a lot of really good shows.
Okay, there.
Give him a look. I mean, it's better if I'm there, but like it's still pretty good if I'm not. So we've got a deck tech here. We're going to look at an Estrid deck. One thing I wanted to mention, we had a YouTube content earlier this week that was not very long, but basically I was like, this deck is bad. You didn't tell him this, or that.
He probably wrote our first iTunes review, too. This is a podcast that exists.
Right. However, I will say this. He's not necessarily wrong, just in a vacuum. And here's why. There's 2 ways you can go about doing this. You can look at a deck and just try to make it as good as you can make it. Or you can try to make it as good as the person's vision of that deck currently is. And those are different things. So, like, if you are wanting to hear us make a deck as strong as humanly possible, and we'll do that if somebody asks us to.
Yeah.
We definitely can. But, like, that's a whole different thing than looking at someone's deck that they currently like, and they kind of want us to do, like, a polish on it, to talk about it, look at it, and, like, say, well, this card will be a little bit better in a situation than this one, so I bet if you fix this thing, it will help you with that thing. And that's kind of what we're trying to do here. We don't want to like rebuild someone's deck from the ground up, because you can do that. An example.
Well, I did that last week.
You kind of did, right? But you also didn't radically change the power level of the deck when you were doing it.
No.
So it would still fit in with the meta that player was playing in. The example I was thinking of is we had a listener in the shop 6 weeks ago or so who stopped in when he was on his way to, I think it was a wedding, and he had a Gonti deck, mono black Gonti deck. And it was about as tuned as you're going to get a Gonti deck.
Yeah.
He was running all the fast mana rocks. There was a whole bunch of different like lines to win a game where I have these, 4 or 5 pieces that allow me to basically infinitely blink in a Grey Merchant or a Kokushko, or if I have this out, I can use, I can't remember if it's Flux Reservoir or what do you have, but like there was multiple ways to get a sequence of things in a combo going to just win a game, and multiple tutors to get to those things. And he played in a very strong meta, and that's how all the decks everyone there plays, so he has to run his things tuned to that level. Conversely, we've seen Gonti decks, and I think we have a couple in our meta, or friends that we know play, that aren't at that level, and
nor do they want to be.
And we could, and there's nothing wrong with either of those 2 power levels. We could very easily look at that, second person's deck and turn it into the first person's deck and make it that power level with all those combos. But if the person isn't playing in a shop or playing in an environment where everyone's playing in that power level, or they don't enjoy doing that, we're not going to turn their second deck into that first deck.
that's a great way to put it. We tend to more polish these decks versus rebuild them.
Yes,
I never really thought
so.
about that way. And another thing is, we ask all these questions to our listeners when we get ready to do their deck tech. And the big one is budget. Like, we could easily turn every Gonti deck into that Gonti deck you were just describing, but you can't do that for $200 total. You can't do that for $300 total. It's definitely one of those things where we're doing it to the best of our ability within the confines we were given by the listener.
Yeah.
If someone says no budget, cool. We might make that hyper competitive deck until we read my meta is pretty easygoing, a lot of decks in the 7 to 8 power level. Okay, well, maybe we aren't going to infinitely loop turns. That's no fun.
So that basically was fun to explain that a little bit, because those are two different things. And, if you are a listener who is going to get a deck tech from us in the future and you want us to try to tune it as strong as we think we can make it, we will gladly do that. But
Go ahead.
I'll say, but for the most part, people aren't asking us to do that. They're asking us just kind of give it the polish, give it the once over. And so that's generally what we do to keep it at roughly the same level it was at for the meta they play in.
Yep. But hey, if you do want that, we'll make sure Chris is here because he's really good at doing that.
He is. We can absolutely do that.
Final thing kind of on that note, though, is, if we did every deck tech where we just said, yep, these are the best 64 cards you should be running, or however many minus your lands, you'd hear the same thing week in and week out. And
sure,
we do suggest, a lot of the same cards every week, Scavenger Grounds,
I was just going to say
Heroic Intervention, but at the same time, we aren't saying everybody who's playing blue should be running all 5 extra turn spells and every infinite mana combo you can do.
But the reality is, every blue deck is going to be stronger with Mana Drain.
Yes.
And probably Force of Will. And every deck just in general is going to be better with Mana Crypt and probably Mana Vault and Grim Monolith and Mox Diamond and probably Chrome Mox. And there's a bunch of those cards that just basically every deck is better if they run them. And you just have to adjust for that, because that's number one, that those things tend to really tweak the power level in a direction that maybe not every meta can handle. So, you kind of got to play it by ear, but for the most part, people just want the tune up, and that's what we're doing.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Michael's deck here. We got some feedback from him about what we're going to do. And he says, I don't have a specific meta because I don't have a regular playgroup or location. My meta shifts and slides. I've put everything from janky, no-win cons to super-tuned Glyph of the Trader CEDH stacks decks.
The original idea for his deck sprang from the interactions between cards like Cleansing Meditation, Enchanted Evening, Aura Shards, Aura Thief, and Sphere of Safety. He also wanted an excuse to make people respect Estrid, the Mast, a bit more than they seem to be doing. The overall theme or goal of the deck was to be an enchantment deck, not an enchantress deck.
And he says he loves enchantments decks, but they're all over the enchantress deck. I'm sorry, Max. But more of an enchantments matter deck. As such, he endeavored to make as much as he possibly could an enchantment or something that interacted with enchantments or benefited from them. Some of these inclusions are a bit of a stretch, like the Planeswalkers, but they are flavorful simply because of the things they interact with enchantments, and they have the added benefit of dodging many board wipes and help with ramp, card draw, and selection, and token creature generation.
The deck wants to play a land every turn early on, and if possible, play some ramp enchantments and some light stacks pieces to protect my board presence, then run out Estrid and use her plus to turbo ramp my mana so to allow large turns that solidify my board presence. The endgame can come in a number of ways: Starfield and Nyx and Enchanted Evening. I may lose all my lands, but crash in with everything else for lethal damage. Add in Aura Thief and a sack outlet like High Market and do the same thing, only with everybody else's board added to mine. Aura Thief and sack outlet is a win con on its own as well. I know the board wipes need to be looked over. Beyond that, any input on all of it would be great.
I feel like it's probably too unfocused and is more of a generic Bant good stuff deck. There are also some cards in the maybe board I would like to maybe include Aura Shard / Replenish, or that could be included like Mirari's Wake, but I don't know what to cut or if they should be in.
I'm not too oppressed to spending money on a deck, but to try to keep individual card prices under $75 to $100. The deck is probably too cutesy, but I appreciate you guys looking at it.
And says, P.S. Fable of a Wolf and Owl is a pet card in this deck and also a big reason he built it. And he's aware that Chris would say it's a trash card, but he loves it. I am a fan of Fable of Wolf and Owl. I agree it's not an amazing card, but it's also a super cool card. It was one of the first cards I saw when I came back to Magic and was playing the game on the iPad. One of the like cheesy intro decks you kind of picked, like that was the one rare. And I thought it was a super cool card. I am a big fan of that card, so I absolutely get why you like it. So a few just brief stats before we get started here. The deck has an average CMC of 3.05, and the majority of the drops in the deck are 2 and 3 drops. Both of those are a pretty sweet spot to be. You're at 305 for an average CMC and having most of your stuff be 2 or 3 mana. Once you get into 3 or 4 mana for most of your cards, it gets tough to cast multiple things per turn. 2 and 3 lets you really easily, by like turn 4, start doing multiple things. Even without ramp, and if you have ramp, you can sometimes do 3 things a turn. That's just a good spot to be with the deck in general. We will look at the lands first. 35 lands. It's a little lighter than I personally like to be in a 3-color deck, but that's a low average CMC as well. And I'm not going to mess with that number. I think if he's content playing at 35 and seems to be happy with that, I think then we can leave that there. What do you think, Max?
I feel 35 is a little light because a lot of these are like fetch lands.
I myself, I would not be comfortable running it, but I'm going to assume he would have fixed it if he was regularly getting burned with an unplayable hand. So,
right. Yeah, I mean, if it's playable hands consistently, sure. Plus, the London Mulligan rule allows you to kind of be more aggressive with your mulligans with a low land count, especially with this low average CMC of the entire deck.
The difference, I think, if you're playing 40 lands in a deck and you are occasionally flooded, I think that doesn't stick in your memory. Like those games when you had 4 lands in your opening hand and then drew 2 or 3 straight lands, that's just a slow start sometimes, and if everyone else is killing the threats, all of a sudden by like turn 7 or 8, maybe it doesn't matter the fact that you were flooded early on. Whereas if you have too few lands, you tend to, number one, remember that because you couldn't do anything on your first 2 or 3 turns. And that seems tougher to bounce back from. If you have too many lands, at the very least, you're still playing lands every turn. So when turn 8 rolls around, you're at 8 mana. You can leapfrog from that. Whereas if you're at, too few of lands, that's much more difficult to, by turn 8, if you've played 3 lands, that's a whole different thing to bounce back from. So I'm going to assume sometimes I think people run too many lands and they don't self-correct it, whereas I think too few, you would probably correct it if it was actually too few.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. I'm going to quick mention this too when we're taking a look at lands. Lands is probably the area in a deck I tend to scrutinize the most because I think everybody has cards in their deck that are a pet card, like Fable of Wolf and Owl, for example, that is something that you run in your deck because you like it, or it's a way to be creative or do something interesting, or it's nostalgic. I don't think mana bases do that. I don't think anyone's running bad mana rocks to express themselves for the most part. And that kind of came up last week, I guess, when that new Arcane Signet from Brawl was released. I didn't love it at first because it's such a generically good rock that will go in every deck. But one of the points Benny Smith made online talking about it was, well, it's your mana base, though. Who cares? It's just how you get there. And then I got thinking about that, and I'm like, that's true. Your mana base isn't what you use in your deck to express yourself or to make the deck cool. It's what allows your deck to do the cool thing. So I think that's also maybe then in thinking that through, that's part of the reason I tend to scrutinize mana bases more and lands particularly, because you just want to use them to get the job done as efficiently as possible. And if your land base is bad, it screws up everything else. And if your land base is good, you don't notice it. You just notice your deck is playing really well. So for myself, when I'm looking at a 3-color deck, maybe I'll get lucky and have the original duels. But if you don't, ideally I want to go fetches, and then as many of the fetchable dual lands as I can find, which are the shock lands, the battle lands, and the Amonkhet cyclers. as many of the battle bond lands as I can cram into a deck. I like the Pain lands next because they're never tapped. The Horizon lands I like because they're never tapped, and if it runs late in the game, you can sack them to draw a card. In a 3-color deck, I'm almost always going to be jamming in City of Brass and Mana Confluence and Exotic Orchard because they make all my colors and they're never tapped. And then I'm probably going to round out with basics. Like, I am going to, in a 3-color deck, try to avoid lands that come into play tapped as much as humanly possible. The exception probably being the Cyclers, just because they're fetchable and they fix my colors. So my primary concern, particularly in a 3-color deck, is to do whatever I can to make sure I have all 3 of those colors, if possible, on turn 3, and have nothing tapped. So, in looking at this land base that has 16 basics, is there anything, Max, that you don't like, or if this was your 3-color deck, anything you would change here?
Yeah. So I'm not a fan of the Seaside Citadel. So that's the Tri-land, the Bant Tri-land. I'm not a big fan of Croson Verge. That's the one that you can pay 2 sacrifice to go get a forest and a plains card and put them onto the battlefield tapped.
Okay.
And I'm also not a fan of... I don't really like Throne of the High City in this deck.
So I'm going to say this, Max. I have 3 lands written down here that I don't like. Seaside Citadel, Croson Verge, and Throne of the High City. Those are literally the 3 I have written down.
Hey, look at that. It's like we've done this before.
It's like we've been on a podcast for 100 episodes. So Seaside Citadel makes all 3 of your colors, but it comes into play tapped. Throne of the High City is a useful card if you need card draw, but I think in these 3 colors, in Enchantress, in a deck where you don't seem to have that much defense, aside from, a few of the propaganda kind of enchantments, you're going to have a ton of blockers, you're going to have a tough time stopping flyers. I feel like it's an invitation to just give somebody else the Monarch for the entire turn.
Yeah.
And I think Croson Verge, it was a card that I ran once upon a time, and I found as my decks have gotten a little more efficient and I've just gotten a little bit better at building them, I don't have mana to use it. I don't need mana sinks that much because I don't have mana lying around I'm not using.
Yeah, I completely agree with all that. Seaside Citadel can easily be swapped out for something like Mana Confluence.
Yep.
Comes in untapped. You pay a life to make any color. He's already running City of Brass, so he has one of the 2. Might as well just slot the second one in there.
I agree.
Croson Verge in this deck, where it's... I kind of compared this to my Tuvasa deck, even though this isn't an Enchantress deck. It's more of an enchantment deck. I don't run it in Tuvasa because that 2 mana is 1 to 2 spells a turn that I don't get to cast.
Yeah.
And it brings in the lands tapped anyways, so it's a huge tempo hit. Maybe in this slower deck, it's maybe worth it. I don't think it is, though.
Maybe if you were playing this deck with, 7 or 8 counter spells, and you were frequently leaving mana up until, to make sure you didn't want to counterspell something, and then you would dump it into your Croson Verge on occasion. That would make sense. But I just don't think this deck is leaving mana up that often because it's not that style deck.
And finally, with Throne of the High City, that's 4 mana to draw a card.
And then probably lose it, given you don't have that much defense here.
Yeah, and then probably lose it.
And probably have no way to get it back, really.
To my just looking through these, you could cut the 2 of them, so Croson Verge and Throne, for the 2 battle bond lands that can go in this deck.
Yeah.
The blue-white and the green-white. And then you cut the other 1, Seaside Citadel, for Mana Confluence, and I think this mana base is pretty much where I would want it.
Sure, yeah. 16 basics is a good safe amount until you're not going to get totally screwed over by a Blood Moon or a Back to Basics. That seems pretty safe. The one card, now I did say I don't like cards that come into play tapped. The one I would probably consider here is maybe Teleria West. It comes into play tapped and taps for a blue, but the real use of it here is the fact that you can cycle it and get something that costs 0 mana, and it's just one more way to go grab Serra Sanctum, or maybe even Deserted Temple if you already have Serra Sanctum and you want to, basically double up your access to all the mana it makes, or even Hall of Helios Generosity. I just think that is useful for the ability to go get a land that is game-changing, and Serra Sanctum is game-changing, and if it's out, going to get that Deserted Temple and basically doubling up your Serra Sanctums is also game-changing. So I think it's worth coming into play tap to have that option there.
Is it worth the 3 mana, though?
If you're going to get Serra
to transmute it? Like
I think it is if you're getting Serra Sanctum. If you were getting something that wasn't as good as Sanctum, that has the ability, because Serra Sanctum very often in this deck, you're going to spend 3 mana, go grab Sanctum, drop Sanctum, and tap it for 6.
Okay, yep,
or 8,
I get
or
that.
10, or 12, or 14, or whatever it is. Like it could be a ridiculous amount of mana. I think Tueri West actually kind of gets overplayed. I've seen people use it in decks that I know they have nothing great that they're going to get. I'm like, what are you going to get in this deck? And they go grab
my island.
Yeah, well, or a dual land, which, okay, is useful, I guess, but like that wasn't worth 3 mana. But if you're in a deck running Gaia's Cradle, or you're in a deck running Serra Sanctum, or Cabal Coffers, Urborg pair, and you want the other half of it, I think it's absolutely worth it. I think this is a deck where I would do it.
Yeah. I also think there's just a little bit of wiggle room with the basics. 16 is a great amount.
16 is safe. But
I think you could probably go down to like 12 or 14 and add the other check lands from, the Ixalan or the Corsets. Because right now I'm only seeing the blue-white one.
Yep.
So there's 2 other ones that could be slotted in there. I love those cards because I do tend to run at least a dozen basics in all of my decks, whether it's 2 colors or 3 colors.
Yes.
So, and plus on top of your shocks, I've always had luck with them coming in untapped. Well, I know you have had the other side of that coin, though.
Yeah. I'm going to say 2 contradictory things here, because we said 16 basics is a good, safe amount to save you from Blood Moon or back to basics. And that's the correct way to play. Just like it's correct to not put all your eggs into one basket with ramp and have some rocks and have some things that ramp you land. However, if no one's punishing you for not playing the correct way, and it's more beneficial to not play the correct way, then don't play the correct way. If you never see Blood Moon, and you never ever see back to basics, and you can get away with running a super greedy mana base of, 8 basic lands and the rest are all duels, then I say do it. If you don't get punished for it, and it's going to benefit you but for having like a perfect mana base with minimal basics, you can go ahead and cheat that. If you never see mass land destruction, then you're probably better off on your green deck just ramping lands versus ramping rocks that are much more likely to die to someone's Vandal Blast. So there's 2 contradictory thoughts. Always diversify and play safe. Unless you don't get punished for not doing that, then go ahead and, go ahead and cheat, basically. So yeah, I basically what I'm saying is I agree. If you don't deal with that stuff, you can absolutely pull some of those basics and drop down.
Right.
The next one we'll jump to here, Max, I think is creatures, because it's a relatively small list here as well.
Okay.
9 creatures.
So we have Ajani's Chosen, which makes a 2/2 cat token creature cat token. Whenever you cast an enchantment, and if it were an aura, you can put it on that token. We have our...
And there is a bit of a token sub-theme here, so that makes sense.
Yes. Argothian Enchantress, just cast an enchantment, draw a card. Aura Thief, like Michael talked about, it has flying, and when it is put into a graveyard from play, you gain control of all enchantments. We also have... I don't know how to read this card, because...
Ephemeris Enchantress.
Ephemeris Enchantress, just another... whenever an enchantment is put into the graveyard, draw a card, so like a reverse Enchantress.
Yep.
Hannah Ship's Navigator. You can get some artifacts or enchantments back to your hand from your graveyard. Herald of the Pantheon reduces your enchantments by 1, and you gain a life every time you cast an enchantment. Mesa Enchantress, cast a thing, draw a card. Shalai, Voice of Plenty. Other planeswalkers you control and other creatures you control and you have hexproof. We'll get back to that one.
Okay.
And then Verudian Enchantress, again, whenever you cast an enchantment, draw a card.
And technically Eidolon of Blossoms is also a creature here, but it's being sorted over into the enchantment category.
Right, you are correct.
So
I missed that one.
I said 9 creatures because I was looking at the deck list here, but there are 10 because of the Eidolon of Blossoms.
Yes. Again, that's just a play a thing, draw a card.
Yes. And it draws a card off itself. It's
Yes.
4 mana, but unlike most enchantresses, it actually draws you a card when it comes into play.
And the big one, I guess, though, is the spell has to resolve
Yes.
versus the other ones are cast triggers.
cast
This is an
triggers.
ETB.
Yep, because it's Constellation. So, Shalai you wanted to talk about, Max, and we'll come to that in a minute.
Okay.
However, the more glaring one that I don't like here is Herald of the Pantheon.
Oof.
So Herald of the Pantheon is 2 mana for 2/2 Centaur Shaman. Enchantment spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and whenever you cast an enchantment spell, you gain life. I think both of those are useful things, and I don't think those things on one card are good enough for a slot in this deck. The mana cost reduction I counted only affects 26 cards in the deck, so less than a quarter of your cards actually get reduced, have their cost reduced by the Herald of the Pantheon. And there's 30 some enchantments in here. Technically there's 33, so you're going to gain some life, but how much really? Let's say this is out, on turn 2, and it's in play the entire game, and you cast 15 of your enchantments. I think that's a reasonable amount to, in a decent length game where you're going through a good chunk of your deck, you're going to cast, let's say, half of them. Best case scenario, is that worth saving mana on, some percentage of those and gaining 15 life in a best case scenario? I don't think it is.
Okay.
The one thing I would replace it with, I think that's kind of an obvious swap, is Satyr Wayfinder, which is the newest enchantment from, I think, the core set last year, and newest enchantress. Even though it's not an enchantress, it just draws you a card when you cast an enchantment spell. I think rather than gaining 15 life and saving a little bit of mana in the best case scenario, I'd rather draw 15 cards.
Yeah.
Every time. So I think given a choice between the two, that's a swap I would make.
Okay. So I agree with you that Herald of the Pantheon in this deck is not great with the statistics you just threw out. I run it in my Tuvasa deck, but Tuvasa is way faster than this deck, and
Sure.
that 1 mana reduction allows me to go from 2 to 3 spells a turn to 5 to 6 spells a turn. Because I'm
you're
just
slapping a bunch of auras on Tuvasa for the most part.
right. That reduction hits 67% of my creatures or enchantments.
And that makes a big difference there.
Big difference. I get it. It says the word enchantment on it. It fits the theme. I think
But
something.
so does Satyr Wayfinder, so I think
Yes.
that's a reasonable swap.
I think if you want something that does the same thing, but might be more impactful, is the new Enchantress out of Core 20, where it reduces all the costs, but it gets a +1/+1 counter for every time you cast one.
Yeah, that makes sense too, because that also kind of fits in with the Enchantments Matter theme. I think making a big creature is probably more useful than gaining some life, I would say.
Yep. And I believe that card is called Starfield Mystic.
There we go. Yep.
So it just gets whenever an enchantment you control is put into the graveyard, it gets a +1/+1. So a little more work, I guess, to get that creature up, but at least it's going to grow versus Herald doesn't grow.
And there's a few other Enchantment Matters things out there, like Umbra Mystic, but I don't think there's enough auras in this deck for Umbra Mystic. I love Nylea's Colossus, but I don't know if, when you double up Tuvasa from a 14/14 to a 28/28 and then do it again.
And then double strike and all that fun stuff.
That's busted. I don't know what here you double up. Even if you do it twice, I don't know if it's worth the mana to. I mean, if Shalai's out and she's a 3/4 and she goes to a 6 and a 12, and then you do it one more time, maybe you can one-shot somebody. I mean, there's probably situations where that's useful. And there are some auras in here. So maybe there'll be games when the Argothian Enchantress is wearing, well, I guess she can't because she has Shroud, but your Verduran Enchantress has 3 auras on her and she's a, 14/14. So maybe, I think it's a great, great card in an Enchantment Matters deck, but I don't know if it's a great card in this version of that deck.
I sort of agree with you.
Okay.
Nylea's Colossus is what I would sub out for Shalai.
Okay, for Shalai.
Mainly because, Shalai's great. It gives
she is.
him hexproof. It gives his walkers, which there are a handful of, and I have a couple swaps I would make there later. And then all your creatures you control have hexproof. So if the token route is kind of plan A, is what I'm getting from his notes.
Yeah.
That's great. It protects all your tokens. Awesome. You can pump them. But it's still a 3/4 body. It dies. It doesn't have hexproof itself. Yeah, you can put a mask on it from Estrid and protect it, but you can't use Estrid at instant speed on someone else's turn.
Right.
This isn't mono blue Teferi. So it's kind of a one-trick pony, in my opinion. Where Nylea's Colossus, yeah, it's a big beater, and this isn't something where he's dropping 3 or 4 enchantments a turn. But you got to remember, Estrid's masks count as enchantments.
Right.
And they enter the battlefield to trigger that constellation.
And, Nylea's Colossus does count itself.
Right.
So you don't necessarily need something else if it on its own might be enough to be worth a slot just because you can use it to kill somebody.
Yep. The only downside with Nylea's Colossus, which could be figured out later, is you need a way to punch that damage through, and right now in this deck there is none whatsoever, whether we're going tokens or one big fatty swinging at someone.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Let's look at Planeswalkers, since you mentioned them.
Okay.
There's 5 utility Planeswalkers, and most of them are kind of utility walkers here. Why don't you read them to us, Max?
So we have Elspeth, Sun's Champion, just all-around great card, makes 3 dudes to protect itself, can blow up anything with power 4 or greater, and then the emblem is creatures you control get +2/+2 and have flying. I feel like that is a win condition in this deck.
Yeah, particularly with like the token sub-theme. Elspeth, I just, if you can run Elspeth, I don't think it's ever, for the most part, a wrong call. She's almost always useful.
Yes.
Same with our next choice here.
Yeah. We also have Garrick Wildspeaker, 4 mana, 3 loyalty, his +1, untap 2 target lands. So it's essentially a 2-mana planeswalker.
Yeah, right.
And if either of those lands are suited up with those auras that make them tap for 2 mana, even better. Or you untap Serra's Sanctum, even better. You can -1 to put a 3/3 beast onto the battlefield, and then his -4 is creatures you control essentially have overrun. +3/+3 and trample.
With the token deck, that's useful.
Great. So our third walker is Serra the Benevolent, another 4-mana walker. Her +2 creatures you control with flying get +1/+1 until end of turn. Her -3 makes a Serra Angel, a 4/4 white angel with vigilance and flying. And her -6 is worship, essentially.
You get an emblem with, if you control a creature, damage that would reduce your life to less than 1 reduces it to 1 instead.
Yes.
And as an emblem, that's pretty tough to deal with.
Yeah.
There's not a ton of creatures here. Serra I like less than the previous 2, but I like Serra in general, so I'm not going to tell someone not to run it if you're just running it because you like the card. I get it.
Same. Fourth Planeswalker, Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. Teferi's just good.
Yeah.
Draw a card, untap 2 lands. At the beginning of your next end step, -3, put target non-land permanent into its owner's library, 3rd from the top. So that's a little bit of the tempo hit. It's not really stacks, but it controls the game. And his emblem says, whenever you draw a card, exile target permanent an opponent controls at -8.
And just like with Garruk's untap ability, the Teferi one doesn't work as well with Serra's Sanctum necessarily because it's at the end of your turn, but both of those work nicely with a couple of stacks-ish cards we'll see later, which are Stasis and Winter Orb. So They give you some ways to break parity that most of your opponents probably won't have.
Right. And then the final one is Venser the Sojourner. +2, exile target permanent you own, return it into the battlefield under your control at the beginning of the next end step. -1, creatures are unblockable this turn.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, there's one way to punch through damage.
Yep, and then -8, you get an emblem with whenever you cast a spell, exile target permanent.
I mean, at the very least, Venser lets you reset Estrid.
But it doesn't. That's my issue.
Okay, well, it's end of turn.
Yes.
But I'm saying, like, if she's down to 1 or something, it would give you the option to bring her back in but it's still only 3. I mean, it's not ideal.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think any of the abilities here are, I don't know, I like Venser, but I don't know if this is the right deck for Venser necessarily. What do you think?
Okay. So Venser, I love Venser. Obviously, I'm Brago. I'm king of the scumbags.
Yep.
The issue with this is you need a critical mass of tokens to make it the -1 worthwhile, in my opinion. You're not going to use that to get, 6 damage through. You're going to use that to get 20 damage through, 40 damage through, or that huge Nylea Colossus to get that through. If you need to blink something, you're either resetting Estrid, you're resetting another Planeswalker, but if you blink anything that has one of Estrid's masks on it, the mask falls off.
Right.
And that's not really worthwhile because that mask is just protection.
Yeah.
So I feel like it's sort of out of place in this deck.
I would agree. I like Venser. I don't know if this is the right deck for Venser, similarly to us talking about Nylea's Colossus, which I think is maybe a better fit than Venser is. I think this probably isn't a deck for Venser.
They do pair well nicely, though. Like, you could blink something. Well, it's still... It comes in at end of turn. No, never mind. I don't know anything.
Okay.
Teferi, I like Teferi in this deck. It's a way to untap some lands, draw some cards, and the middle ability to put something in their deck seems great.
Yes.
Sarah, she protects herself, but unless you alt Elspeth, her plus is not doing anything in this deck.
Not really, no.
So you're really just, minusing her and hoping you can reset her with Venser.
Yeah.
So that doesn't seem ideal to me.
I would agree.
And then Elspeth Sun's Champion, we said it already. This is solid in this deck, especially with tokens being plan A, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. Elspeth's great.
Do you have any suggestions?
I felt like any Planeswalker I wanted to pull, I was not probably going to replace it with a Planeswalker. I'd replace it with something else, probably an enchantment or something later on.
Okay. I have a couple that could be considered to be replaced if we want to go walker for walker.
Was one of them the Johnny that interacts with Elspeth in terms of giving her extra abilities? Or extra loyalty? No? What'd you have? My
first one is Narset, Parter of Veils. Mainly because stopping your opponents from drawing more than one card is great, especially if you want to control the game. This deck is supposed to be kind of medium paced, slow the pod down, so nobody goes, drawing 100 cards in one turn.
It kind of, it fits the Staxy theme here a little bit.
Yep. Plus, her -2 can find an enchantment.
If Narset didn't have her passive ability for the 3 mana she cost to cast and getting at least 1 activation and probably 2 of that minus ability,
she's still really good.
She's still really, really good, let alone that ability that's so good that's passively just always there.
Yes. My other one, so I would probably swap Narset for Sarah.
Okay.
Just because it seems more impactful.
Yeah, I can see that.
At any point of the game. Sarah, I think, is great late game if you have enough tokens and can give them flying or something, but early game, Narset's great. Especially because that's when people are casting their Anticipates, that doesn't draw. You know what I mean? Like their Read the Bones or stuff like that. My other one is Jace, Unraveler of Secrets. This is a 5-mana Planeswalker. His plus ability says scry 1 and then draw a card. Card selection is great. If you're getting flooded, put that thing on the bottom, draw something else. His first minus ability is bounce target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, I believe. Return target creature to its owner's hand. But his emblem at -8 is whenever an opponent casts his or her first spell of each turn, counter it. That is very impressive in a Planeswalker that you kind of want to be that Staxy control build that this deck, I think, is aiming to be.
Yeah, that would make sense to me.
And I would swap this out for Venser, I think.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. There's a handful of different Planeswalkers that I think would, in general, do more work than Venser. So I agree with that. Should we jump to the instant spells now? There's 6 of them in this deck. Crop Rotation, which is always probably going to be used to get Serra Sanctum, and if that's already out, the Deserted Temple to untap Serra Sanctum. Cyclonic Rift is Cyclonic Rift. It's definitely cheating. Dawn Charm, which has a couple of modes to protect yourself.
What?
The Cyclonic Rift comment or the Dawn Charm comment?
The Cyclonic Rift comment.
Cheating. You're cheating. I mean, I run it. I'm a cheater too.
You're just upset you didn't get to draft it.
You're right. You're 100% correct. A couple of tutors, Enlightened Tutor and Mystical Tutor, and Return to Dust to remove a couple of artifacts. Well, artifact or enchantment, I should say. I like crop rotation. Rift is Rift. Tutors make sense in this deck. I like Return to Dust as well. I think I kind of like Crush Contraband a little bit more now, but Return to Dust is perfectly fine. I think the one card in this list of 6 that I don't love is Dawn Charm. I think if I want something to protect myself and I'm not on a strict budget, which he isn't, I would just rather have Teferi's Protection.
I 100% agree with you. Otherwise, if budget is a little bit of a factor, Heroic Intervention is in the maybe board.
Yeah.
You don't have a lot of in the air blocking, but anything that's going to come on the ground, if you're able to throw some blockers in front of it, that's just as good as the fog because they're all indestructible.
I mean, we were talking about the Planeswalkers, if I was pulling Teferi and then pulling Dawn Charm, I would replace them with Teferi's Protection and Heroic Intervention, the 2 changes I would make. Those cards literally can win you the game when someone casts that board wipe that's going to reset everything, and you just don't participate in that. Everyone else loses their stuff. It's almost like a third Rift in a way with both of those cards. Rift bounces everyone else's stuff to their hand and you keep your stuff. With Protection and with Heroic Intervention, everyone else loses their stuff for the most part when those kind of wipes come out, and you keep your stuff. So it functions similar to Rift. They're both cards that have won me games multiple times. They're also efficient enough that they're worth casting to save one thing. Teferi's Protection for the 3 mana to save one thing being targeted if it's really powerful or really useful is worth it. Same with Heroic Intervention. Let alone if you save an entire board state from, a Back to Nature or something along those lines. So those would be the swaps I would make there. Anything else from you, Max?
No, my personal preference would be maybe like one counter spell, to stop that Back to Nature or stop a Rift or stop a Merciless eviction, right?
Yeah, Merciless Eviction.
There we go. Stops one of those because exiling all your enchantments
is bad business.
Is super bad.
Yeah, it feels bad.
Dawn Charm is cool. It's a fog. I'd rather just run fog if that's the main mode you're using it for.
Yep.
But you don't have many creatures to regenerate, and all the wraths that you're worried about don't target. So
right.
Dawn Charm to me just feels like a dead card 92% of the time.
I would agree. 7 sorcery spells here, and I can read those off. We have Cleansing Meditation, which is a enchantment wipe, destroy all enchantments, but if you have Threshold, instead destroy all enchantments and return to play all cards in your graveyard destroyed this way. So it lets you destroy all enchantments in play and then bring yours back, essentially, which is going to get some triggers off of things like Constellation sometimes. Yeah. So I like Cleansing Meditation. There's Creeping Renaissance to choose a permanent type and return all those cards from your graveyard to your hand. Echo of Eons, which is the basically Time Twister, assuming you flash it back. If you don't, it's just an expensive Time Twister. Hallowed Burial, which is put all creatures in the bottom of their owner's library for 5 mana. Ponder and Serum Visions are a couple of cantrips, and Regrowth. I think if you have the ability to find a replenish, and it's $50. That's a lot of money for a piece of cardboard, but it's in his maybe board. I think if you have the ability to run replenish in an enchantment deck, a deck with 33 different enchantments, I have a really tough time not running it. And Creeping Renaissance has some upside, the ability to get creatures if you need to, like if you've lost 2 enchantresses and that's your draw engine, and I'm just going to bring back Argothian Enchantress and, Verdurn Enchantress and cast one of them this turn and 2 enchantments and draw 2 cards. That feels good sometimes, but Replenish ends games. There's those times when there's 14 enchantments in your graveyard and you cast Replenish and they all come back in, and the amount of things that just happened then is nuts. So I feel like if you have one, I think you have to run it. It's so good.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I don't know. I think all these sorceries are fine. I don't think none of them are backbreaking. I do like Cleansing Meditation. I've never seen that card before, so that was really interesting to see. I like that threshold mechanic. I think, Echoes of Eons is cool. I think if you're really in that, I guess it does shuffle your library back in, so I would say if you need it for the wheel, just put Windfall in. It's cheaper. But, it does shuffle his graveyard back into the library and his hand. But I don't know. I think they're fine. I don't think any of them help him do what the deck wants to do. That's the issue.
Sure. The two I don't necessarily love in this deck are Ponder and Serum Visions.
Yeah.
Not that they're not both great cards. I'm not going to say that at all. They are both fantastic cards. I think in this particular deck where, like, a lot of times when you cast a Ponder or Serum Vision, it's to get a chain going. I want to get these so I can get this thing to get this thing to... In those blue decks that are running like a dozen different cantrips or 12 cantrips, you're trying to dig down as far as you can dig to find a tutor or find something else lets you dig further. Those chains really aren't here in for Ponder and Serum Visions, and they're still really, really decent cards, but I think if I just wanted to have a one-time dig down effect, I would be perfectly fine having that in the form of something like Sylvan Library or something like Search for Azcanta, where I can dig every single turn with the effect versus just once, and there are enchantments that interact with the other things that care about enchantments in my deck. So those are two I would consider in that Ponder Serum Vision slot is Sylvan Library and Search.
Yep, totally agree with you there.
And, particularly Sylvan Library, there's going to be enough times when you're like, I'm just going to draw, 2 cards, and the next turn, I'm still only... 6 life lower than the next person, I'm going to draw 2 more and draw 2 more. And or you'll gain life from something else. And yeah, they're both just fantastic cards. I think they have way more upside in this deck than Ponder and Serum Visions do.
Yeah.
Any other ones here you like or don't like?
You know what? I can't really comment much on the sorceries just because I'm looking at like my Tuvasa list and I run 4, so he has way more than I do.
I mean, he did mention his board wipes, and you obviously could, run Supreme Verdict or run, just Wrath of God or something. Like, you could have a few more Wraths. There's Winds of Wrath that destroys non-enchanted creatures. So if you're throwing auras on stuff, there are a few auras here. Winds of Wrath is good, too. I think a lot of that just depends on maybe your meta and what your play style is. The only real board wipe here is Hallowed Burial, which is an exile.
No, it's a berry.
It's a berry. Yeah, bottom of your library, it's a berry. Final Judgment is the exile one.
Yeah, I think something just like Wrath of God or even Day of Judgment would be fine in this deck just to deal with the problems.
Yeah, just one more. I think. Yeah. I don't think you need. And again, that might be what I would replace Sarah with. Like if I was going to pull Sarah, I might replace Sarah with Supreme Verdict for 4 mana. And it can't be countered, and it gets the job done as well. So. Okay, artifacts. Only 4 of them. Expedition Map, Mirage Mirror, the Chain Veil, and Winter Orb, which we mentioned as a stacks piece with Estrid because you can still untap your lands using her ability, assuming they have the mask token on them. Chain Veil makes sense with Estrid to use her abilities twice. X-Map, I'm assuming it's just one more way to go grab Sarah's Sanctum or go grab her to Temple. Mirage Mirror is a great card. I like it a lot. Maybe it's a way to copy Sarah's Sanctum, too?
I have no idea, because that's the best thing I could come up with was copying either Sarah's Sanctum or any of these enchantresses.
And if it copies Sarah's Sanctum, then it gets destroyed anyway, doesn't it? Because they're both
legendary.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, I mean, I love Mirage Mirror. I don't know. This is also maybe not a great deck for it.
I mean, maybe it's more defensive. Like, hey, I have a Grave Titan swinging at you. Okay, well, my Mirage Mirror is now a Grave Titan.
And I've done that plenty of times with Mirage Mirror before.
I think you don't want to copy any of the auras because it's gonna fail to target.
Right.
And just looking through the other enchantments, I don't know what would be so great to make a copy of that you need more than one of.
Yeah, it's a great card, but I feel like if you're relying on someone else's stuff to copy, I don't know if that's enough. And I don't know if there's anything in this deck that's worth doing it of your own stuff. So that's one I would maybe replace something with there.
Yeah, and it kind of nombos if he has Sterling Grove out.
Right.
Like, you can't target your own stuff.
Yep. And Sterling Grove is a great card, so I don't know if I would... So...
Chainveil's great, especially with the amount of Planeswalkers in this deck, or even adding more if you wanted. That'd be cool. Winter Orb, and we're going to just talk about Stasis right now, too.
Sure.
I get it. Estrid can be a stacks commander. My issues with these are I'm typically not a big fan of this type of playstyle, is seeing that you don't have a dedicated meta or even a shop you go to maybe once a month to play at. Walking into an unknown pod, whether it's at a Magic Fest or at your buddy's house that you only see every couple months, or just, you're traveling and you run into a random card shop. I don't want to sit across from an Estrid deck and all of a sudden your turn 2 is Winter Orb followed up by Stasis.
Right. And I'm going to guess there's not a ton of stack stuff here, so I'm going to guess what happens is those get dropped early and they're just used to slow things up until this deck can get some pieces in play, and they probably go away. I don't think it's like a long-term plan to just grind things down with Stasis, untapping masked lands every turn and like making the game take as long as possible. Because that's a strategy with Estrid, but I think you need more stacks pieces than this deck has. So I think it's probably just something that the deck does early on to buy time. But I think there's probably ways to buy time that aren't going to tick off
everybody,
a stranger like Winter Orb and Stasis will.
Right. And, if you want to go with a Pillow Fort-esque strategy, you could play something like Windborne Muse. Yeah, it doesn't say the word enchantment, but it's still another Pillow Fort card that you could play in these colors. Or you could just play a couple more creatures.
Yeah, or there's a couple more actually Pillow Fort type enchantments. There's War Tax. There's I'm forgetting a couple of the other ones that aren't quite as good as Propaganda, but there's a couple different variants on that affect how people that make people not want to attack or make it difficult for them to attack, and you could use those as well. I'm not necessarily against Winter Orb or Stasis in this kind of deck where you can break parity pretty easily and gain an advantage. I'm not against it. But I do think, strategically speaking, it might make more sense to run things that are less likely to make people target you.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Okay. So the last thing we have here, Max, are the enchantments.
Yeah, we can skip these. They're not important. They're just, just the bulk of the deck.
That's all we got.
They're good. They do things. Good job.
We were joking about that, but like really, it's the bulk of the deck. It's 33 cards, 32 if you ignore Eidolon of Blossoms. But this is also... like, I don't know if many of these come out. Like, there's a half a dozen different enchantments that go on the lands, which kind of interacts with Estrid's ability to untap things that have auras on them.
Yep.
So, and it, affects things like Serra Sanctum. I think that's a really useful tech in this deck in general. There's things like Darksteel Mutation to take out creatures, while also being an enchantment and being really, really good. Enchantress's Presence, it draws you a card. A few different auras that are actually like back-breaking, whether it's Ethereal Armor. Well, there was at least one more I saw that was pretty decent. Things like Overburden. Whenever a player puts a creature card into play, that player returns a land. You have so few creatures in this deck, and it doesn't affect your tokens. You're breaking parity there as well. So Empty Throne. Whenever you cast an enchantment spell, create a 4/4 white angel. Plays with the existing token theme. Fluttering Tithe obviously is a crazy good card. Sphere of Safety, which we mentioned, along with Propaganda and Ghostly Prison, are ways to keep you safe. Sterling Grove keeps your enchantment safe. So yeah, there's a lot of things here that I think are really, really solid, and I don't know that I think completely makes sense in this deck. But there's a couple things I would pull.
I agree.
The first one I would, or at least add, the first one I would add is Ancestral Mask. You're running Ethereal Armor, so you aren't afraid to have at least a couple auras. And Ancestral Mask in this deck on a creature that can get through, kill somebody.
Yeah. With 33 enchantments, and that's counting Eidolon.
And Ancestral Mask counts all enchantments in play, not just yours. So you might well pick up another +10 or +12 or +14, just from other people's stuff that's in play.
Yeah, each player having 2 or 3 other enchantments out, that's a lot of damage coming through if you can get it through. I want to comment on all the auras that attach to lands.
Mm-hmm.
In my personal experience, I think I prefer the ones that make 2 mana of any combination versus the ones that only let that land tap for any color. Because if you're gonna put something on a forest that only creates another color, you're either gonna tap that for green or you're gonna tap it for blue or white.
Right. Like abundant growth basically just turns any land into a command tower, essentially.
Right.
Whereas something like Fertile Ground actually lets it make an additional mana.
Yep. Or something like New Horizons. You can tap that colorless land. Like, let's say you don't need to use Hall of Heliod's Generosity for the colorless. Cool, I'm going to tap it to make blue and white, and I just fixed my mana.
Right, yep.
So I have actually found myself in my Tuvasa deck pulling off of those cheap 1 to 2 mana auras for my lands that just make it create any color or an additional green, and going to the more 3 mana, 4 mana ones that let that land produce any 2 colors, because I would love to tap my Reliquary Tower for blue-white.
Right, yeah. Yeah, the ones I think you want to be cautious of are the ones that don't actually give you extra mana. They just say land can be tapped to produce mana of any color, because there's a couple of those out there that don't actually give you mana plus. They're just fixing, and I don't think those are worth it. I think Abundant Growth is one of them in this deck. So those are the ones I would try to avoid.
And
Winter's Rest is another one I wanted to point out quick that I don't love. That's a new card that was in Modern Horizons. It's an enchant creature, and when Winter's Rest enters the battlefield, tap enchanted creature, and as long as you control another snow permanent, it doesn't untap during its controller's untap step. There's not that much snow stuff here anyway.
Well, all of his basics are snow.
Okay, that's true.
All 16 basics
and there's
are
a
snow.
good amount. However, that doesn't stop passive abilities from happening.
Right.
And it doesn't stop activate abilities that don't require tapping. I think, for the exact same casting cost, you can just lignify something if you want an enchantment that shuts off a creature. And yeah, it can still attack, but it's a 0/4, so unless you're hitting a creature with, 10 counters on it or something, Lignify just turns it off for good. It doesn't get a passive ability, it can't use an activated ability that doesn't require a tap. It's just not doing anything.
Right.
I think Imprison of the Moon costs 1 more. Like, Lignify is a perfect 2 mana for 2 mana swap, but Imprison the Moon lets you also turn off Planeswalkers and lands, I believe, correct?
Let's look. It's in his maybe board. Enchant creature, land, or planeswalker. It becomes a colorless land. Yeah, I would
much rather have that.
Yeah, I thought the same thing about Winter's Rest. Granted, that lockdown effect is nice, but like you said, it doesn't stop passive abilities. It doesn't stop any non-tap abilities. So something like Imprison the Moon, Lignify. I mean, he's already running Song of the Dryads and Darksteel Mutation, so those are your next 2 good ones. There's also that new one from, Core 19?
Yeah, with the Avacyn art on it.
Yeah. That was from Modern Horizons.
Oh, you're right. Yep.
But same thing. It's another type of shut down that commander.
There's Deep Freeze in blue as well that does the same thing that basically transforms
that's the one I was
it.
thinking of. Yep.
So yeah, there's a handful of those in different colors that I think do the same thing better than Winter's Rest. Because you don't care if Urza can't attack and is tapped. You don't care if Yawgmoth Threat Position is tapped and can't attack. It's doing all those things even if it's locked down with Winter's Rest. You want those things turned into something else and have the abilities gone.
Yeah. How do you feel about Growing Rights of Itlimoc in this deck?
I don't think that was the next one for me. I love the card. I don't think there's enough creatures to utilize it here or to flip it over.
I 100% agree.
There is tokens, but I also think that the tokens in this deck aren't that strong, and there's not a lot of beaters or ways to buff them easily. So I don't think you're going to be recklessly swinging with 4 creature or getting creatures out early enough to maybe flip it when you want to. There's times it's going to flip, but I just don't love it here.
Yeah. So my issue is there are 10 creatures in this entire deck, counting Eidolon.
Yep.
When you play, let's say you play Growing Rights on turn 3 or even turn 5, you're not going to hit a creature.
Right.
Statistically, you're not going to hit one. So then you put all those awesome enchantments that you probably want to play instead on the bottom of your library.
Right.
I think it's a very high risk for a very low reward, especially when you're already running something like Sarah's Sanctum. If this was more all these enchantments made tokens, something like, Awakening Zone or From Beyond or stuff like that, maybe then it's worth it, but there isn't a lot of that stuff going on.
Yeah. Nope, I agree with that. That's about it. Night Soil was one I didn't really know if I loved or not. Remove 2 creatures from any graveyard from the game and put a start playing token in play. Graveyard Hate's really good, but you have to remove 2 creatures, and that can be tricky, but I've also seen it do a lot of work, so I'm kind of torn.
I kind of agree. I like it because it is Graveyard Hate. And you know what? A lot of people like playing creatures. So if you're just at a Magic Fest and you're just playing against a bunch of random people that just like to play creatures, that card's going to do work.
Look at the draft we're doing right now for charity. Half those decks are built around putting stuff in the graveyard.
Yeah, I don't know what they're all thinking. I think something that would help this deck kind of bump up the creature production would be something like Luminarch Ascension. There's enough stasis, Staxy, Pillow Fort effects in this deck where if you drop it before turn 6, maybe, you're probably fine at least being able to get it to where you can make angels. So I think it's definitely worth the include. I'm not a big fan of Leyline of Anticipation in this deck because of
Flash. There's not really combat tricks you can do. And I like Leyline of Anticipation, but I could see it being underwhelming in this deck.
Yeah. I think that's everything I have to say about the enchantments.
Yeah, that's about it for me as well. Well, then I think that about wraps up our look here at this Banchantress deck. It's Estrid, which is interesting. It's basically the same base precon, Max, as you built your Tuvasa deck from, and there's some overlap in terms of creatures, but it looks like it plays significantly different than how your deck plays.
Oh, vast night and day difference, in my opinion. This is something that if Michael got the right pieces out before I could get my pieces out, this deck might actually not be something I want to face.
And that shows, I think that's says something about the design last year. A lot of people were kind of down on the decks last year, but the fact that Banchantress deck can play so differently between Tuvasa and Estrid, I think shows they really did something right for sure there.
Yeah, most definitely.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Michael, for supporting the show and letting us take a look at your deck. We really appreciate it. It means a lot, deeply. The fact that people support us to the point where we will do a show about you is a big deal to us, and thank you very much.
Yes, and thanks for coming out and hanging out with us at Magic Fest Kansas City back in, May?
That was in May, yep.
Hey, look at that, I remembered.
And I think, did Michael give us the beer that we got from Kansas City?
He did, he gave us those homebrew beers. They were pretty tasty. They were. One was a cherry wheat. It was pretty good.
We actually drank them when we were recording the show, and I think we forgot to mention that we were drinking them while we were recording while we were doing it. So
that's right.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that, for everything you did. It was great to meet you, and that's going to wrap up this episode. Our podcast theme is Retro Future Dirty by Kevin MacLeod. The show is edited by Ken Peddle. You can find him on Twitter at LOAD3R. You can find me at Dana Roach. You can find Max at CMDR_. Max? I didn't write it down tonight. Is that right?
That is correct.
All right. And you can find Chris at WiseSquishy1. We're back next week. Until then, I'm Dana.
And I'm Max.